This video is going to take you through about the first half of the central nervous system chapter, which is chapter 12 in the Merriam textbook. To start you out, I just have some interesting stuff for you. So this mount or presentation was completed by a couple of students, gosh, nearly 100 years ago at this point, where they dissected the human down to just the central nervous system, and you can see in the peripheral nervous system. And you can see the spinal cord and the cranial and spinal nerves that are coming off of that. And it's oh my gosh, can you imagine having to do this? I'm hoping this was an extra project that they did for med school, because I can't imagine that they were required to do that for their classes, but what do I know about med school back in the 1920s? It's not like I was alive for that. I'm not that old, y'all. This video, I have a link to it in Schoology so that you guys can watch it. It's a doctor who is running you through the anatomy of an unfixed brain. The brains that you guys dissect in lab have sort of two problems. One, it's a sheep brain, not a human brain. And two, it's fixed, which is a formalin-preserved brain. It changes the texture. Also, the way that they vacuum pack the brains prior to shipping can change the shape of the brain sometimes. So I give you guys this just so you can see what a real human brain is like prior to preservation processes. And so if you have a chance, I recommend you watch that video because you can get a lot of anatomy stuff from that video. Okay, from there, we start talking about some of the basic anatomy of the brain proper. So the cerebrum is divided into two hemispheres, the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere. In this mount or specimen, I suppose, it's this part that you've got up here. Let me turn my wonderful little highlighter on. So it's this whole section up here is the cerebrum of the brain. And like I said, there's a Zay Frank video out there where he talks about marsupials and how they don't have a thinky part of their brain, especially the koala bears. We have a very large thinky part. We store a lot of memories. We're capable of, well, a lot of us are capable of some really good problem solving. I've met some also really stupid people in my time, so we're not all, but a lot of us are capable of some really good problem solving. Let's see, now I gotta click a different button. Brainstem is everything on this picture in green. You've got the midbrain, which is a relay station that's taking information from distal portions up towards the cerebrum. The pons, which controls a lot of respiratory movement, and the medulla, which a lot of people sort of call the reptilian part of the brain. It's the part of your brain that keeps you alive. It's responsible for things like your heart rate, your blood pressure, your respiratory rate, things like that. The ventricles are the portions of the brain that are hollow chambers. They contain a lot of cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF for short. You have two lateral ventricles that you can see in this picture. So there's one, there's another. So they're separated by a little wall called the septum pellucidum. You guys should have seen the septum pellucidum when you did your sheep brain dissection in lab. Then you have a third ventricle and then a fourth ventricle coming down on the side. Those are both smaller. You can actually see the fourth ventricle larger on this side. But yeah, those contain a lot of CSF. Cerebral hemispheres, I already talked about the right and the left hemispheres. There are a lot of people out there that think that they're like either right-brained or left-brained. That's not true. You use both hemispheres of your brain. The gyri, or a gyrus, is singular. Those are the elevated ridges of tissue on the brain, the bumps, if you will. Sulci or sulci, sulcus is singular. Those are the depressions or valleys between the ridges. Extra deep valleys, those are called fissures. Now, superficially, your brain has 4 lobes, but if you look a little deeper, there is a 5th lobe. The 4 superficial lobes are sort of color-coded for you in this picture as sort of pink, and then a bunch of blues, light blue, middle blue, and dark blue. The pink is the frontal lobe. Part of the pink and blue is the parietal lobe. Light blue is the occipital lobe. Dark blue is the temporal lobe. And if you peel back like they're doing in this picture, the frontal from the temporal, the insula is deep to those other layers. From there, I gave you this picture to label. So make sure you do go through and you label your stuff. So essentially, there is a little bit of everybody is different. That said, there are a lot of features that are conserved across people that tend to do the same thing in most people. The frontal lobe of the brain tends to be concerned with motor functions, so everything up here is about moving you. The posterior lobes of the brain, parietal, occipital, those tend to be concerned more with sensory information, so they're receiving information and processing that information. All of the sort of pink stuff off down here, they're called multimodal association areas. We've got a lot of memories that are stored in there. Those are what I like to call connect the dot areas, because they are doing exactly that. They're connecting the dots between memories so that this smell plus this sight, you put them together and those two things together mean that's a skunk, for example. And so association, they're associating those things together. The central sulcus is the dividing line between the motor stuff towards the front and then the sensory stuff towards the back. Let's see. This little area that's in dashed right here, this is one thing. So ordinarily, whatever you have on the right side of the brain, you're going to have repeated on the left side of your brain. This is one area that doesn't follow that rule. This is called the Broca's area. Broca's area is usually just on the left-hand side, the left hemisphere of the brain, and it's responsible for the movements necessary for speech. So moving your lips and your tongue and your glottis so that you can make all the sounds necessary for speech. This area that's highlighted up over here, it's Wernicke's area, and it's responsible for auditory processing. So those are not usually repeated on both sides, essentially. And so I just wanted you to have that little bit of information there. Let's see. From there, we just start talking about the function of each specific area. Make sure you know where these areas are found and then what those areas are supposed to do. So I'm going to show you the same picture that I just showed you a second ago so you can see them and then tell you what they do. So primary motor cortex gives you conscious control of skeletal muscles. So when you think of a particular movement, this is the part of the brain that tells a specific muscle what they need to do in order to help you carry out that particular movement. Premotor cortex is right in front of the primary motor cortex, so it's this little area coming off right here. It is more for stored muscle memory sort of stuff. I'm sure you've heard of muscle memory at some point in your life. Once you've learned how to do a particular skill, the blueprint for how to do that muscle movement, it comes to this area, so you don't have to think about it as much anymore. Now, it's still voluntary, it's still conscious. It's just that you're not thinking about every single individual little motor unit anymore like you had to when you were using your primary motor cortex. So it's a learned skill type of thing. Now, this is also where I like to pause for a minute and mention almost everything that we know about the brain. We know about it because of things that harm a person in a specific part of the brain. We observe them to find out what exactly goes wrong. If you've taken a psychology class, hopefully you've heard of Phineas Gage. He is the gentleman who worked on the railroad. He was patting down some, I don't remember if it was dynamite or TNT, but there is a difference, so whatever. He was doing an explosives pat down. He was supposed to put a layer of sand on top of that and then put his iron spike down in there, and he forgot the layer of sand, put his iron spike in there, and it blew up, and it drove the spike through his skull and blew out a big chunk of his brain and survived that. And so we could observe him afterwards and look at, well, what can he not do now that he could do before? Because those parts of the brain that are missing, they must have been responsible for those things. When people have strokes and a certain part of the brain dies, we can look at what things people can't do anymore. So if a person has a stroke in the primary motor cortex, they can't actively think about doing a particular movement and do that movement anymore. When they have a stroke in the premotor cortex, they unlearn the learned skill. So they will forget how to type. But if the primary motor cortex is still intact, they can still go back and consciously type out a letter like hunt and peck and figure that out. It will just be that they type much slower now because they forgot how to do the learned skill of typing, or they forgot how to ride the bike, or they forgot that muscle memory type stuff. So everything will be slower in that case. So hopefully that helps you understand the difference between those two things. Broca's area, I mentioned earlier, muscle movement for speech, usually just in the left hemisphere. Frontal eye field is about eye movement. Remember, frontal cortex, all about movement. This is not where your vision is figured out. This is how you move your eyes up, down, all around so you can see things that are up, down, or to your right or left or whatever. Pretty much already addressed that question earlier, so blowing past it. Now we're going to start looking at the stuff behind the central sulcus. Primary somatosensory cortex. So somato means body. Sensory is sensing. So this is you sensing your body. Like, are you laying down, sitting down, standing up? Are your knees bent? Are they straight? What's going on with your body right now? And I want to point out, it is right beside your primary motor cortex. And that's because it's really important to know where your body is right now before you start thinking about how you want to move it right now. And so those two things are right next to each other because it's really hard to move if you don't know where you are. Somatosensory association. So remember, association is you connecting the dots between things. So this is you feeling things and then knowing what that means. So the reason I have the picture of the coins up here is, even if you can't see the coins, you just reach into a pocket and you're feeling them. You can still feel the difference between a nickel and a quarter, even though they're relatively similar in size, because there is a difference in the feeling between those two things. So it's feeling stuff and knowing what those things are based on how they feel. Visual areas are way back at the very back of the occipital lobe, and this is where you process visual information. So this is where your pictures go so that you can see images. Auditory areas are for hearing. Olfactory cortex is for smelling. Gustation is taste. Visceral sensory area, anytime you see viscera, that means gut. And again, sensory is sensation. So this is you being aware of sensations in your gut, like, are you full? Are you hungry? Do you need to pee? Do you need to poop? That sort of stuff. Vestibular cortex. So part of your inner ear has nothing to do with hearing. It's about balance. That part of your ear is called the vestibule. The vestibular cortex is the part of the brain that the vestibule in your ear talks to. So it's the part of your brain that processes your balance and then your head position. Multimodal association area. Again, this is where your memories are, and this is where you're connecting those dots that we mentioned earlier. Limbic association area. This is a big part of you processing your memories, and this is also how you process your emotions and feel your emotions. Corpus callosum. Hopefully when you dissected your brain, you paid pretty good attention to this because you had to cut through this in order to separate your two hemispheres from each other. This is a big old collection of white matter that connects the right hemisphere to the left. Hey, Captain, don't play with the squeaky toy right now. Hey, look, our auditory cortex is working. Give me that squeaky. Give me that squeaky toy. Play with the quiet toy right now. The corpus callosum allows the two hemispheres to communicate with each other. And really, this is the only place where those two hemispheres communicate with each other. Aside from this, they're doing... Oh my goodness, you're an annoying little dog sometimes. This is the only place where they do talk to each other. A weird little factoid for you guys is in people who have really severe epilepsy, sometimes it's like their brain, their two hemispheres are sort of competing for who's going to be in charge. And one of the ways that we can treat those really severe forms of epilepsy is actually severing the corpus callosum so that the two hemispheres can't compete anymore. Because if you can't communicate, you can't compete.